The morning air on Kepler 442b carried the metallic taste of war, but Commander Sarah Chen barely noticed anymore. She stood on the observation deck of the human colony ship Resilience, watching the purple-tinted sunrise paint the alien landscape in shades she still couldn't quite believe were real. 3 years of fighting the Zephyrian Empire had taught her that beauty and brutality often shared the same sky. "Commander, incoming transmission from Earth Command," her aide, Lieutenant Rodriguez, announced from behind her. Sarah didn't turn around immediately. These days, messages from home usually meant more bad news, more impossible orders, or more politicians trying to second-guess tactical decisions from light years away. The Zephyrians had been humanity's first contact with alien intelligence, and it had gone about as well as every pessimistic scientist had predicted. The crystalline beings saw humans as nothing more than primitive mammals who had somehow stumbled into space travel. When humanity refused to abandon their outer colonies and return to their proper place in the solar system, the Zephyrians decided to teach them a lesson about the natural order of the galaxy. Sarah finally turned and nodded to Rodriguez. The transmission flickered to life, revealing Admiral Morrison's weathered face. Even across the vastness of space, she could see the exhaustion in his eyes that matched her own. "Chen, I'll keep this brief. The situation at Proxima Station has deteriorated. We're pulling the Fifth Fleet back to defensive positions around Earth. That leaves your forces as the primary resistance in the outer colonies." Sarah felt her stomach drop, but her expression remained neutral. The Fifth Fleet represented nearly 40% of humanity's remaining military assets. Without them, her small task force of 12 ships and 30,000 ground troops would be facing the full might of the Zephyrian war machine alone. "Understood, sir. What are our new objectives?" Morrison's pause lasted too long. "Survive, Commander. Make them pay for every inch of ground, every ship, every life. Intelligence suggests the Zephyrians are planning something big. We need time to prepare Earth's defenses." The transmission ended, leaving Sarah staring at empty space where the Admiral's face had been. Behind her, Rodriguez cleared his throat. "Ma'am, the other ship commanders are requesting a briefing." Sarah nodded absently. She was 28 years old and had been fighting in space for longer than she'd been an adult on Earth. Sometimes she wondered if she remembered what peace felt like, or if the constant weight of responsibility had always pressed down on her shoulders like this. The briefing room aboard the Resilience was cramped, designed for a crew complement that no longer existed. Half her ship commanders attended via hologram, their vessels spread across 3 star systems in a desperate attempt to cover as much territory as possible. Captain Martinez from the Defiant looked like he hadn't slept in days. Commander Park from the Steadfast kept checking her tactical display even during the meeting. They all knew what the withdrawal of the Fifth Fleet meant. "Ladies and gentlemen, our situation has changed," Sarah began, activating the strategic display that showed their current positions. Red markers indicated confirmed Zephyrian fleets, while yellow showed probable enemy movements. The amount of red was overwhelming. "We're now the primary resistance force in the outer colonies. Our mission remains the same: protect civilian populations and deny the enemy strategic resources. However, our tactical approach will need to evolve." Captain Singh from the Courage leaned forward. "Commander, with respect, we're outnumbered 50 to 1. Our ships are running on minimal supplies and our ground forces are exhausted. How exactly do we hold against an empire that considers us vermin?" Sarah had been asking herself the same question for hours. The answer she'd found wasn't pretty, but it was the only one that made sense. "We stop fighting their war and start fighting ours. The Zephyrians expect us to behave like a conventional military force. They expect formations, predictable tactics, and honorable surrender when the situation becomes hopeless." She touched the display, zooming in on the asteroid fields between their position and the nearest Zephyrian fleet. "They don't understand that humans didn't evolve to be reasonable. We evolved to be stubborn, creative, and absolutely ruthless when our survival is at stake. We're going to use that. Over the next 6 months, Sarah's task force became something the Zephyrians had never encountered before, a human military unit that refused to play by anyone's rules but their own. They mined asteroid fields and detonated them when Zephyrian ships passed through. They hacked enemy communications and filled their networks with human music, literature, and art, not as psychological warfare, but as a declaration that human culture would outlast Zephyrian empire. Sarah's personal ship, the Resilience, became legendary among both human and Zephyrian forces. She would appear in systems where the enemy thought they had achieved total control, strike hard at supply lines and command centers, then vanish before superior forces could respond. Her crews learned to think like guerrilla fighters in space, using every dirty trick that desperation could inspire. The breakthrough came during the Battle of Titan's Gate, a strategic choke point that controlled access to 3 human colonies. The Zephyrians had assembled their largest fleet yet, over 300 ships, to finally crush Sarah's forces and secure the outer colonies. Every tactical simulation suggested that humanity's last stand would last approximately 4 hours. Sarah stood on the bridge of the Resilience as enemy ships filled their sensors. Her crew was silent, professional, and absolutely terrified. She could feel it radiating from every station, but she could also feel something else, a grim determination that surprised even her. "All ships, this is Commander Chen," she broadcast on the open channel. "Today, the Zephyrians learn why humans don't stay extinct. For every one of our ships they destroy, we take 10 of theirs. For every human life they take, we make them remember us for 1,000 years. Today, we show them what happens when you threaten our people." The battle lasted 18 hours. When it ended, the Zephyrian fleet had been reduced to scattered survivors, fleeing back to their own territory. Sarah's task force had lost 8 of their 12 ships, but they had accomplished something that military theorists said was impossible. They had made an empire afraid of a species it considered primitive. The victory at Titan's Gate changed everything. Suddenly, other alien species that had been watching the conflict began to take notice. The Galactic Council, which had initially supported the Zephyrian police action against an aggressive new species, started asking questions about human tactics and technology. Most importantly, they started asking questions about human resolve. Sarah found herself summoned to Earth for the first time in 4 years. The homecoming felt surreal after so long in space, but she barely had time to appreciate being back on solid ground. The military brass wanted detailed briefings on her tactics. Politicians wanted to understand how a small human force had achieved what they were already calling the miracle of Titan's Gate. But the real shock came when Admiral Morrison called her into his office 3 days after her arrival. "Chen, you're being reassigned," he said without preamble. Sarah felt her heart sink. After everything they'd accomplished, after proving that humanity could stand against galactic powers, they were going to stick her behind a desk somewhere. "Sir, if this is about my tactical decisions," Morrison held up a hand. "It's not a punishment, Commander. It's a promotion. The Galactic Council has agreed to formal diplomatic relations with humanity. We need someone to represent our interests, someone who understands both human capabilities and alien psychology, someone who's proven that humans deserve respect." Sarah stared at him. "You want me to be a diplomat? I want you to be our first ambassador to the Galactic Academy. It's a neutral institution where young beings from across the galaxy study together, learn about different cultures, and form the networks that will shape interstellar politics for generations to come." The weight of the assignment settled on Sarah's shoulders. After years of fighting for humanity's survival, she was being asked to fight for something even more challenging: humanity's future place in a galaxy full of species that still saw them as newcomers at best and dangerous primitives at worst. "There's one more thing," Morrison continued. The Academy operates under strict nonviolence protocols. No weapons, no military ranks recognized, no special treatment based on previous accomplishments. You'll be starting over as a first-year student, studying alongside beings who may be decades or even centuries younger than you. Sarah almost laughed. After commanding fleets in the depths of space, after staring down the most powerful military force in the galaxy, they wanted her to go back to school. The irony was almost too much to handle. But as she thought about it, she began to understand the real challenge. Winning a war was one thing. Soldiers understood strength and tactics and sacrifice. But earning respect in a classroom full of young aliens who had grown up believing humans were inferior, that would require a completely different kind of courage. "When do I start?" she asked. Admiral Morrison smiled for the first time since she'd known him. "Transport leaves for the Academy next week. Chen, don't let them forget what humans are capable of." As Sarah left the Admiral's office, she realized that her war wasn't over. It was just changing battlefields. Instead of fighting for humanity's survival, she would be fighting for something equally important: the right of her species to be taken seriously by a galaxy that still saw them as children playing with adult toys. The Galactic Academy was located on Centauri Prime, a neutral world that orbited a binary star system. As Sarah's transport approached the planet, she studied the briefing materials about her new classmates. There would be Zephyrians, the same species she'd been fighting for years, though hopefully younger and more open-minded ones. There would be Altarians, known for their mathematical prowess and contempt for emotional species like humans. There would be vegans, who communicated primarily through biochemical signals that most other species couldn't even detect. And there would be her, a human war hero trying to convince them all that her species deserved a seat at the galactic table. The Academy itself was magnificent, a series of crystalline spires that seemed to grow from the planet's surface like frozen music. Students from dozens of species moved between buildings, their various forms of locomotion creating a complex dance that somehow avoided collisions despite the apparent chaos. Sarah's quarters were small but comfortable, designed to accommodate the basic needs of oxygen-breathing species. As she unpacked her few possessions, she'd learned to travel light during the war. She found herself wondering if she'd made the right choice. Part of her missed the clarity of military life, where objectives were clear and success could be measured in terms of ships destroyed or systems defended. Here, success would be measured in minds changed, in subtle shifts of opinion, in the slow work of building respect one conversation at a time. It was a different kind of warfare, fought with words and ideas instead of plasma cannons and tactical missiles. Her first class was Introduction to Galactic History, taught by Professor Kethvar, an ancient Altarian who had apparently been present for several of the events covered in the curriculum. As Sarah entered the lecture hall, she became immediately aware of the attention her presence drew. Conversations stopped, and dozens of alien eyes tracked her movement as she found an empty seat near the back. The whispers started as soon as she sat down. She caught fragments in various languages, but the meaning was clear enough. The human was here. The primitive who had somehow defeated the Zephyrian Empire was sitting in their classroom like an ordinary student. Professor Kethvar began the lecture without acknowledging the disturbance, but Sarah could see his multiple eyes occasionally flicking in her direction. The topic was the expansion of the Zephyrian Empire and its role in establishing galactic order. As the professor described Zephyrian military doctrine and technological superiority, Sarah bit her tongue and took careful notes. When Kethvar reached the recent conflict with humanity, his tone became noticeably cooler. The human incursion into Zephyrian territory represents a significant disruption to established galactic order. Despite their primitive technology and emotional decision-making processes, they managed to achieve several tactical victories through unpredictable and often irrational behavior. A Zephyrian student near the front of the class, a young crystalline being, whose faceted form caught the light in complex patterns, raised a appendage that might have been equivalent to a hand. "Professor, how is it possible for a species that has only been spacefaring for 2 centuries to defeat an empire that has maintained galactic order for millennia? Was it simply luck?" Kethvar's response was diplomatic but dismissive. The humans demonstrated a capacity for unconventional thinking that, while crude, proved temporarily effective against established tactical doctrines. However, this success was limited in scope and ultimately unsustainable against superior technology and strategic thinking. Sarah felt her jaw clench. She had lost friends in those temporarily effective engagements. She had watched good people die buying time for evacuations that saved millions of human lives. But she forced herself to remain silent. This wasn't a battlefield where she could respond to insults with plasma fire. This was a classroom where words were weapons, and she was still learning the rules of engagement. The lecture continued, but Sarah barely heard it. She was beginning to understand the real scope of her mission here. It wasn't enough to prove that humans could fight effectively or think creatively. She had to prove that humanity deserved to be treated as equals by species that had been playing galactic politics since before her son was born. As the class ended and students began filing out, Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to leave. The Zephyrian student who had asked the question approached her, moving with the characteristic fluid grace of his species. "You are the human commander," he said, his translated voice carrying harmonics that her universal translator couldn't quite capture. "I am Zethkri of the 4th Resonance. I studied your tactical decisions at Titan's Gate for my military history project." Sarah looked at him carefully. This close, she could see that his crystalline structure was still developing, marking him as young by Zephyrian standards. "And what did you conclude? That either you are significantly more intelligent than your species profile suggests, or human unpredictability is a more potent weapon than our strategists understood." He paused, the light patterns within his form shifting in what might have been curiosity. "I am not certain which possibility is more disturbing to my people." For the first time since arriving at the academy, Sarah smiled. Maybe that's exactly the point. As she walked back to her quarters, Sarah realized that her real education was just beginning. She had spent years learning how to fight aliens. Now she had to learn how to live with them, study with them, and somehow convince them that the strange species from the 3rd planet of an unremarkable star system deserved to be taken seriously. The war for humanity's survival was over. The war for humanity's respect had just begun. 3 months into her first semester at the Galactic Academy, Sarah Chen had learned that academic warfare was far more subtle and infinitely more frustrating than actual combat. In space, when someone shot at you, the threat was obvious and the response was clear. In the classroom, hostility came wrapped in polite questions, academic discourse, and the kind of intellectual condescension that made her want to grab the nearest Altarian by their elongated neck and explain human determination in terms they could understand. The worst part was that her professors and fellow students weren't entirely wrong. Humanity was young, technologically primitive compared to galactic standards, and prone to emotional decision-making that other species found baffling. What they couldn't understand was that these apparent weaknesses were also sources of tremendous strength. Sarah's breaking point came during Professor Veltar's Strategic Analysis seminar. The Vegan instructor had been systematically dismantling human military doctrine for 3 weeks, using Sarah's own tactical decisions as examples of instinctive responses that occasionally produce favorable outcomes despite their lack of theoretical foundation. Today's lesson focused on resource allocation during extended conflicts. Veltar had constructed an elaborate scenario where human colonies were under siege, and students were tasked with developing optimal response strategies. The exercise was clearly designed to demonstrate human inadequacy compared to more evolved species. "Miss Chen," Veltar said, his biochemical communication devices pulsing in patterns that the universal translator rendered as mild condescension, "perhaps you could enlighten us about human decision-making processes during resource scarcity. Your species' response to the Zephyrian blockade of Kepler Station provides an interesting case study in suboptimal choices." Sarah looked around the seminar room at her fellow students. 23 young beings from across the galaxy, all waiting to see how the primitive human would embarrass herself. She had been patient for 3 months, taking notes while professors explained why her species' greatest military victories were actually examples of lucky accidents and poor planning. "Professor," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest, "I think there might be a fundamental misunderstanding about human strategic thinking." Veltar's chemical emanations shifted to what might have been amusement. "Please elaborate." Sarah stood up, ignoring academy protocol that required students to remain seated during discussions. "You keep analyzing human tactics as if we're trying to implement Altarian mathematical models or Zephyrian hierarchical decision trees. You're measuring our effectiveness against standards designed for species that think differently than we do." "Indeed," Veltar replied. "That is precisely the point. Galactic civilization has developed optimal approaches to conflict resolution based on millennia of experience across hundreds of species. Human deviation from these proven methods suggests, Professor, with respect, your proven methods failed." Sarah's interruption sent a ripple of shock through the classroom. Students didn't interrupt professors at the Galactic Academy, especially not human students with something to prove. Sarah continued before Veltar could respond. "The Zephyrian Empire used your optimal strategies for 3 years. They had superior numbers, superior technology, superior strategic position, and the support of the Galactic Council. According to every simulation model you've shown us, they should have crushed human resistance in 6 months." She activated the classroom's holographic display, calling up the actual battle records from Kepler Station. "Instead, let me show you what actually happened when humans stopped trying to fight like everyone else expected us to." The display showed the Kepler system as it had been during the siege. 7 human colonies spread across 4 planets and 16 asteroid mining platforms, surrounded by a Zephyrian fleet that outnumbered the human defenders 15 to 1. According to standard tactical doctrine, the human response should have been to consolidate forces, establish defensive positions, and attempt to hold out until reinforcements arrived. Your textbooks say we should have evacuated the outer colonies and concentrated our defenses around Kepler Prime, Sarah continued. That would have been the logical choice. It would have maximized our defensive efficiency and minimized resource expenditure. She manipulated the display, showing the tactical scenario playing out according to optimal strategic doctrine. The simulation was devastating, human forces holding for perhaps 2 weeks before being systematically eliminated. But we didn't do the logical thing. Instead, we did something that your strategic models can't account for. We refused to abandon anyone. The display shifted to show what had actually happened. Instead of consolidating, human forces had spread themselves impossibly thin, trying to defend every colony simultaneously. On paper, it looked like madness. Every military advisor told me we couldn't hold 17 separate positions with our limited forces. Every strategic analysis said we were guaranteeing our own destruction. And you know what? They were absolutely right. Sarah could see that she had the attention of every being in the room now. Even Professor Veltar's biochemical emanations had shifted to something that might have been genuine curiosity. We couldn't hold 17 positions with conventional tactics, so we invented unconventional ones. We turned mining equipment into weapons. We used civilian transports as decoy warships. We convinced the Zephyrians that our evacuation ships were actually trying to escape, then detonated their cargo holds when enemy ships moved in to capture them. The tactical display now showed the actual battle as it had unfolded. A chaotic mess of desperate improvisation, last-minute heroics, and tactical decisions that violated every principle of sound military doctrine. It also showed something else, a Zephyrian fleet that became increasingly frustrated, confused, and ultimately demoralized by an enemy that refused to behave predictably. The siege lasted 8 months, Sarah continued. We lost 12 of our 17 positions, but we evacuated every civilian. More importantly, we tied down a major Zephyrian fleet for 8 months instead of 2 weeks. That gave Earth time to prepare defenses and other colonies time to organize their own resistance. Professor Veltar's silence stretched for nearly a minute. When he finally spoke, his chemical emanations were carefully neutral. An interesting perspective, Miss Chen. However, you're describing tactical improvisation born of desperation, not systematic strategic thinking. Professor, that's exactly my point. Sarah felt the familiar surge of combat adrenaline, but this time channeled into intellectual rather than physical battle. You keep looking for human systematic strategic thinking and concluding we're primitive because we don't have it. But what if systematic strategic thinking isn't the only valid approach to complex problems? She gestured to her fellow students. Every species represented in this room has developed sophisticated decision-making processes optimized for their particular psychology and environmental pressures. Altarians use mathematical modeling because their minds work like quantum computers. Zephyrians use hierarchical command structures because their crystalline nature makes parallel processing natural. Sarah paused, making sure she had everyone's attention. Humans evolved as persistence hunters on a world that tried to kill us every day for millions of years. We didn't develop systematic strategic thinking because systematic strategies got you eaten by something bigger, faster, and smarter than you were. Then how did your species achieve spaceflight? Asked Kiraneth, a young Altarian whose mathematical abilities were already legendary among the student body. The same way we achieved everything else, Sarah replied. We kept trying things until something worked. Then we kept improving it until it worked better. We call it muddling through, and it's the most powerful problem-solving methodology in known space because it doesn't require you to understand a problem completely before you start working on solutions. The classroom erupted in a dozen different forms of communication as students began arguing among themselves. Sarah could see translations flickering across her universal translator as vegans debated with Zephyrians, while Altarians attempted to construct mathematical models of human decision-making processes. Professor Veltar restored order with a chemical emission that translated as mild annoyance. Miss Chen, while your defense of human capabilities is spirited, you haven't addressed the fundamental inefficiency of your approach. Systematic planning prevents wasted resources and reduces casualties. Sarah smiled, recognizing the opening for her strongest argument. Professor, may I ask how many species the Galactic Council has successfully integrated over the past millennium? Approximately 47, Veltar replied, clearly puzzled by the direction of the question. And how many of those species had achieved interstellar travel independently before contact? 12, including the founding species of the Council. So 35 species were uplifted by Council intervention, given technology and guidance to help them develop according to proven galactic standards. Sarah looked around the room at her fellow students. How many of those uplifted species have made significant independent contributions to galactic civilization? The silence that followed was answer enough. Everyone in the room knew the statistics. Uplifted species tended to remain dependent on Council guidance, contributing resources and labor, but rarely developing innovative technologies or solving novel problems. Humans achieved interstellar travel independently, Sarah continued. We developed our own technologies, our own social systems, our own approaches to problems that the rest of the galaxy considers solved. And when the most powerful empire in known space tried to put us back in our proper place, we found ways to fight back that your strategic models couldn't predict. She gestured to the tactical display, still showing the chaotic beauty of human improvisation at Kepler Station. Maybe the reason uplifted species don't innovate is because systematic strategic thinking is actually a dead end. Maybe true advancement requires the kind of productive inefficiency that only comes from not knowing the right way to do things. Professor Veltar's biochemical emanations had shifted to something that the translator couldn't quite interpret. After a long moment, he spoke again. "Miss Chen, you're suggesting that ignorance is superior to knowledge." "I'm suggesting that different doesn't mean inferior," Sarah replied. "And I'm suggesting that a galaxy where everyone thinks the same way is a galaxy that's stopped growing." The debate that followed lasted for the remainder of the seminar and continued in the corridors afterward. Sarah found herself surrounded by students who had never really considered that galactic civilization might have blind spots, or that their carefully optimized systems might be missing something important. The most surprising conversation came from Zethkri, the young Zephyrian who had first approached her after Professor Kethvar's lecture. He found her in the Academy's Central Commons that evening, where students from different species gathered to study and socialize. "Commander Chen," he said, the light patterns in his crystalline form shifting rapidly in what Sarah had learned indicated deep thought. "I have been analyzing your arguments from today's seminar." "And?" Sarah asked, looking up from her homework, an essay on galactic trade regulation that was about as exciting as it sounded. "I believe you may be correct about the limitations of systematic strategic thinking," Zethkri admitted, "but I am struggling with the implications. If optimal decision-making processes are not actually optimal, then much of what my people believe about galactic civilization may be incomplete." Sarah could hear the distress in his translated voice. For a young Zephyrian raised to believe in the inherent superiority of their civilization, questioning fundamental assumptions, was probably as traumatic as her own transition from military commander to academy student. "Zethkri," she said gently, "I'm not saying your people's achievements aren't real or important. The Zephyrian Empire has maintained peace and prosperity across hundreds of star systems for thousands of years. That's incredible." "But," he prompted, "but maybe there are other ways to achieve peace and prosperity. Maybe some of those ways might even be better in certain circumstances." Sarah gestured around the commons, where dozens of species were peacefully coexisting despite radically different biologies and psychologies. "Look around. This place works because it brings together different approaches to thinking and problem-solving. Nobody's trying to make everyone identical." Zethkri's form flickered as he processed this. "You believe diversity of thought is more valuable than optimization of thought." "I believe they're not mutually exclusive," Sarah replied, "and I believe that any system that can't handle diversity is probably more fragile than it appears." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Kiraneth, the young Altarian mathematician, along with several other students who had been in Professor Veltar's seminar. Sarah recognized the determined look in their varied alien features. They wanted to continue the argument. "Sarah," Kiraneth began, "I have been running simulations based on your tactical decisions at Kepler Station. The mathematical models suggest that your approach should have failed catastrophically." "But it didn't fail," pointed out Talara, a vegan student whose chemical communications added complexity to every conversation, which suggests that the mathematical models are incomplete. "Precisely," Kiraneth agreed. "But if our models are incomplete, how do we determine optimal strategies for novel situations?" Sarah found herself at the center of what was rapidly becoming an impromptu philosophy seminar. Students from a dozen different species were gathered around, debating fundamental questions about knowledge, strategy, and the nature of intelligence itself. Maybe, Sarah suggested. You don't determine optimal strategies ahead of time. Maybe you develop adaptive capabilities instead. The debate continued late into the night, ranging across topics that Sarah had never imagined discussing with alien beings. The relationship between efficiency and resilience, the role of failure in innovation, the question of whether galactic civilization had become too stable for its own good. As the gathering finally broke up and students headed back to their quarters, Sarah realized something had shifted. 3 months ago, her fellow students had seen her as an interesting oddity, the primitive human who had gotten lucky in a few battles. Tonight, they had argued with her as an intellectual equal, challenging her ideas while taking them seriously enough to debate. It was a small victory, but Sarah had learned to appreciate small victories. They accumulated over time, like the tactical advantages that had eventually won impossible battles in impossible circumstances. Walking back to her quarters, Sarah encountered Professor Veltar in one of the Academy's garden areas. The vegan instructor was tending to a collection of plants from his homeworld, their bioluminescent patterns creating shifting displays of color in the artificial twilight. "Miss Chen," he said without looking up from his work, "I wanted to thank you for today's discussion." Sarah was genuinely surprised. "Thank me? I have been teaching strategic analysis for 2 centuries, Veltar continued, his biochemical emanations now carrying notes that the translator rendered as contemplation. In all that time, no student has ever challenged the fundamental premises of the curriculum with such effectiveness. He finally looked at her, his multiple sensory organs focusing with an intensity that made Sarah slightly uncomfortable. "You have given me much to consider about the nature of optimal solutions and the value of diverse approaches to problem solving. Professor, I wasn't trying to undermine your teaching." "On the contrary," Veltar interrupted, "you were doing exactly what education is supposed to accomplish, forcing both teacher and students to examine their assumptions and expand their understanding. If our methods cannot withstand intellectual challenge, then perhaps they are not as sophisticated as we believed." As Sarah continued toward her quarters, she reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. A year ago, she had been commanding starships in desperate battles against overwhelming odds. Tonight, she had won a different kind of battle, not for territory or resources, but for the more subtle but equally important goal of intellectual respect. The war wasn't over. She could see it in the way some professors still dismissed human contributions to galactic civilization, in the casual assumptions about human inferiority that permeated Academy culture, in the surprised reactions when she demonstrated knowledge or insight that exceeded their expectations. But the tide was turning, one seminar discussion at a time, one challenging question at a time, one moment of intellectual recognition at a time. Sarah was fighting for something that might be more important than any military victory, the right of humanity to be seen as equals in a galaxy that was just beginning to understand what humans were really capable of achieving. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that different didn't mean inferior, and new chances to show that sometimes the most powerful weapon in any conflict was the refusal to accept that the battle couldn't be won. As she finally reached her quarters, Sarah smiled at the irony. She had come to the Galactic Academy expecting to learn about alien civilizations. Instead, she was teaching them about the universe's most dangerous species, humans who refused to know their place. The crisis began with what should have been routine maintenance on the Academy's atmospheric processors. Sarah was in her advanced xenological studies class when the first alarm sounded, a low, harmonious tone that indicated a general assembly rather than immediate danger. Professor Cathara, an ancient centaurian whose species had founded the Academy 3 millennia ago, dismissed the class with the kind of calm efficiency that came from centuries of managing young beings from volatile species. Sarah gathered her materials and joined the stream of students flowing toward the main assembly hall. The buzz of conversation in dozens of languages created a complex symphony that her universal translator struggled to parse. Fragments reached her. System malfunction in Sector 7. Emergency protocols activated, probably just another drill. The assembly hall was a marvel of engineering, designed to accommodate the atmospheric, gravitational, and sensory needs of nearly 100 different species simultaneously. As students filed in, Sarah noticed the subtle tension among the faculty members gathered on the platform. Professor Veltar's biochemical emanations were shifting rapidly through patterns she had learned indicated stress. Even the normally unflappable Professor Kethvar seemed agitated, his multiple eyes tracking the crowd with unusual intensity. Dean Mordak, a massive crystalline being whose species Sarah didn't recognize, activated the hall's central communication system. His words were translated into dozens of languages simultaneously, creating an odd echo effect as different temporal processing speeds caught up with each other. "Students and faculty of the Galactic Academy," he began, "we are experiencing a critical failure in the atmospheric processing systems that maintain life support for 17 different species groups. Our engineering teams are working to identify and resolve the issue, but current projections suggest that emergency evacuation may be necessary within 6 to 8 hours. A ripple of alarm swept through the assembly. Sarah could see students from methane-breathing species huddling together, their environmental suits already showing stress indicators. Near the front of the hall, a group of young Altarians were frantically running calculations on personal devices, their mathematical minds probably trying to optimize evacuation procedures. "All students should return to their quarters and prepare for possible emergency departure," Dean Mordak continued. "Faculty advisors will provide species-specific guidance for evacuation procedures. Please remain calm and follow established protocols." As the assembly dispersed, Sarah found herself walking alongside Zethkri and Kiraneth. The Zephyrian's crystalline form was flickering with rapid light patterns that indicated extreme agitation. "This is unprecedented," he was saying. "The Academy's life support systems are designed with 17 layers of redundancy. Simultaneous failure should be mathematically impossible." Kiraneth's response came through her universal translator, with the mechanical precision typical of Altarian speech. "Impossible events that occur anyway typically indicate incorrect understanding of the underlying system parameters." Sarah was only half listening to their analysis. Something about the situation felt wrong to her, and she was trying to identify what was triggering her instincts. During the war, she had developed a sense for when tactical situations were more complex than they appeared. The feeling was rarely wrong. "Zethkri," she said, interrupting his technical discussion with Kiraneth, "who would have access to the Academy's atmospheric processing systems?" "The engineering staff, of course, senior faculty members, the maintenance AI systems." He paused, his form flickering as he processed the implications of her question. "Sarah, you believe this is not an accident?" Before she could answer, her personal communicator chimed with an urgent message from Professor Veltar. "Miss Chen, please report to Laboratory Complex 7 immediately. Your assistance may be required." Laboratory Complex 7 was located in the Academy's research sector, an area that Sarah had never had reason to visit. As she made her way through corridors that grew progressively more deserted, she began to understand why Professor Veltar had contacted her specifically. The laboratory complex was in chaos. Emergency lighting cast strange shadows across equipment that Sarah couldn't identify, while faculty members from multiple species worked frantically at various control stations. At the center of it all, Professor Veltar was coordinating what appeared to be a desperate troubleshooting effort. "Miss Chen," he said as she approached, "thank you for responding quickly. We may need your particular expertise." "Professor, I'm not an engineer. I'm not sure how I can help with atmospheric processing systems." Veltar's biochemical emanations shifted to patterns that indicated grim determination. We have discovered that this is not a system failure. Someone has deliberately sabotaged the life support systems using methods that our security protocols were not designed to prevent. Sarah felt the familiar ice-cold clarity that had always preceded her most difficult battles. You're dealing with an enemy who doesn't follow your rules. Precisely. Professor Veltar gestured toward a massive holographic display that showed the Academy's atmospheric systems in real time. The saboteur has introduced cascade failures that appear to be random system degradation, but are actually carefully orchestrated to overwhelm our repair capabilities. Sarah studied the display, her tactical mind automatically translating technical systems into patterns she could understand. This is guerrilla warfare applied to infrastructure, small actions designed to create large, unpredictable consequences. Our engineering teams are attempting to address each failure as it occurs, Veltar continued, but the saboteur appears to be staying ahead of our repair efforts. At current rates, we will lose atmospheric integrity for multiple species groups within 4 hours. Sarah could see the problem immediately. The Academy's response was systematic, logical, and completely predictable, exactly what an intelligent saboteur would count on. Professor, have you considered that trying to fix everything might be playing into their strategy? What do you mean? You're responding to their moves instead of making moves they have to respond to? Sarah gestured at the display. They've created a complex problem and assumed you'll try to solve it systematically. What if you don't? Professor Cathara approached from across the laboratory, his multiple eyes focused on Sarah with intense curiosity. Miss Chen, are you suggesting we abandon systematic repair procedures? I'm suggesting we think like humans instead of like Altarians. Sarah pointed to specific sections of the atmospheric system on the holographic display. Instead of trying to fix 17 different cascade failures, what if we deliberately shut down everything except the core systems needed to support basic life functions for the largest number of species? The silence that followed was profound. Sarah could practically hear the mental grinding as professors who had spent centuries optimizing complex systems tried to process the concept of deliberately making those systems simpler. That would mean abandoning optimal atmospheric composition for dozens of species, Professor Cathara said slowly. Yes, Sarah agreed. It would also mean that the saboteur's carefully planned cascade failures would become irrelevant. You can't create a cascade failure in a system that's already shut down. Kira Neth, who had apparently followed Sarah to the laboratory complex, stepped forward. Sarah, I have been analyzing the sabotage patterns. Your approach would work, but it would require species with incompatible atmospheric requirements to share emergency shelters. The mathematics indicate significant risks of biochemical conflicts. Sarah smiled grimly. Kira, has anyone ever told you about human emergency protocols? Over the next 2 hours, Sarah found herself coordinating an emergency response that violated every principle of optimal crisis management. Instead of trying to maintain perfect atmospheric conditions for every species, they created shared emergency zones where different species would have to make do with compromise solutions. Methane-breathing species shared space with oxygen breathers by using portable atmospheric processors. Species with incompatible pheromone systems learned to communicate through text-based systems instead of chemical signals. Students who had never interacted directly were suddenly depending on each other for survival. The most challenging integration came when the Zephyrian students, accustomed to crystalline environmental matrices, had to share space with thermal-sensitive species whose presence disrupted their natural energy patterns. Sarah watched Zethkri work with a group of young Altarians to develop a rotation system that allowed both groups to maintain basic physiological functions without causing mutual discomfort. This is highly suboptimal, Kiraneth observed as she helped Sarah coordinate the emergency arrangements. Multiple species would be more comfortable in monospecies evacuation groups. Probably, Sarah agreed. but monospecies groups would be easier for our saboteur to target. Mixed groups are harder to predict and harder to disrupt. As if to prove her point, the Academy's emergency systems detected another sabotage attempt, this time targeting the evacuation routes that would have been used for species-specific emergency protocols. The attack failed because those routes were no longer critical to their improvised survival strategy. Professor Veltar approached Sarah as she was helping a group of students from incompatible species establish a communication protocol that didn't rely on the Academy's central translation systems. "Miss Chen, our security teams have identified the saboteur," he said, his biochemical emanations indicating a complex mix of relief and embarrassment. "It was one of our own faculty members, Professor Zentak from the Theoretical Physics Department." Sarah wasn't entirely surprised. "Let me guess. He's from a species that was uplifted by the Galactic Council and has never been comfortable with the Academy's policy of treating all species as intellectual equals." "How did you—" "Yes, that is exactly correct." Veltar paused. He apparently viewed the Academy's recent openness to diverse approaches as a threat to galactic stability. Sarah looked around the emergency shelter where she was standing. Students from a dozen different species were working together to solve problems that their individual biology and psychology would never have equipped them to handle alone. Zephyrians were learning to think in terms of biological tolerance ranges instead of optimal crystalline matrices. Altarians were discovering that mathematical optimization sometimes mattered less than social cooperation. "Professor," she said, "I think Professor Zentak may have just proved the opposite of what he intended." The crisis officially ended 6 hours later when the Academy's engineering team successfully isolated and repaired the sabotage damage. But the real resolution came in the days that followed, as students who had shared emergency shelters continued to work together on projects that neither group could have accomplished independently. Sarah found herself at the center of something she hadn't expected, a fundamental shift in how the Academy approached interspecies education. Instead of keeping different species in carefully controlled optimal environments, faculty members began experimenting with mixed species problem-solving exercises that required students to adapt, compromise, and innovate. The changes weren't universal or immediate. Some faculty members remained convinced that systematic optimization was superior to adaptive improvisation. Some students from long-established galactic civilizations struggled with the concept that their species' approaches to problems weren't necessarily optimal for all circumstances. But enough minds had been changed to create momentum. Professor Veltar redesigned his strategic analysis curriculum to include case studies in productive sub-optimization. Professor Cathara began offering seminars on cross-species collaboration that attracted students from across the Academy. Most importantly, Dean Mordak announced that the Academy would be establishing a new department focused on adaptive problem-solving methodologies and asked Sarah to serve as its founding director after graduation. The offer should have been the culmination of everything she had worked toward: recognition of human capabilities, proof that her species deserved respect in galactic civilization, and a chance to shape how future generations of galactic citizens would approach complex challenges. But as Sarah stood in her quarters looking out at the binary sunset that painted Centauri Prime's sky in impossible colors, she found herself thinking about something Admiral Morrison had said during her last conversation with Earth Command. Don't let them forget what humans are capable of. She activated her personal communicator and requested a priority channel to Earth. Admiral Morrison's face appeared on the display, older and more tired than she remembered, but with eyes that still held the sharp intelligence that had guided humanity through its darkest hours. "Chen," he said without preamble, "please tell me you're calling with good news. The political situation here is getting complicated, and we could use some positive developments in galactic relations." "Sir, "I've been offered a permanent position at the Academy," Sarah said. "Director of a new department focused on adaptive problem-solving methodologies. It would give humanity a formal voice in galactic education policy." Morrison's expression brightened. "That's excellent news, Commander. Congratulations." "Thank you, sir, but I'm not sure I should accept." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Sarah began to wonder if the communication lag was longer than she had calculated. "Chen," Morrison finally said, "you've been fighting for humanity's place in galactic civilization for over a year. This offer represents everything we hoped to achieve when we sent you to the Academy. Why would you consider declining?" Sarah looked out at the Academy's grounds, where students from across the galaxy were moving between buildings in the complex dance of interspecies coexistence. "Because I've been thinking about what happens next, sir. The Academy is important, but it's also isolated. The real challenge isn't convincing educators that humans have valuable perspectives. The real challenge is convincing galactic civilization as a whole." "And how do you propose to do that?" Sarah smiled, feeling the same sense of clarity that had always preceded her most important tactical decisions. "By doing what humans do best, sir. By refusing to accept that some problems are unsolvable." 3 weeks later, Sarah Chen graduated from the Galactic Academy with highest honors in strategic analysis and a special commendation for her contributions to interspecies cooperation. She declined the offer to direct the new Adaptive Problem-Solving Methodologies Department, much to the surprise and disappointment of the faculty. Instead, she accepted a position with the Galactic Council's Diplomatic Corps as a specialist in non-traditional conflict resolution, a job description that had been created specifically for her unique background and demonstrated capabilities. Her first assignment would take her to the Rigel system, where 3 species were locked in a territorial dispute that had defied resolution for over 2 centuries. The Galactic Council had tried mathematical optimization, hierarchical arbitration, and systematic resource allocation. Nothing had worked. But they had never tried sending a human who specialized in making impossible problems solvable through the simple expedient of refusing to accept that they were impossible. As Sarah's transport departed from Centauri Prime, she received a final message from Zethkri. The young Zephyrian had been accepted into the Academy's new adaptive problem-solving program and was looking forward to challenging some of his own species' assumptions about optimal solutions. "Commander Chen," his message read, "thank you for teaching us that different approaches can be more valuable than perfect approaches. I believe the galaxy is about to become a much more interesting place." Sarah leaned back in her transport's observation lounge and watched the Academy shrink to a point of light against the binary stars. Zethkri was right. The galaxy was about to become more interesting, because humanity had finally earned something more valuable than respect or recognition. They had earned the right to be themselves in a universe that was just beginning to understand what that meant. The war for humanity's survival was over. The war for humanity's respect had been won. But the most important battle was just beginning. The long, slow, incredibly important work of teaching an ancient galaxy that sometimes the most profound wisdom came from the youngest and most stubborn species in known space. As her transport jumped to hyperspace, carrying her toward the next impossible problem that needed a human solution, Sarah Chen smiled and began planning how to convince 3 alien species that their unsolvable territorial dispute might just need someone who didn't understand why it was supposed to be unsolvable. After all, humans had never been very good at knowing their place, and the galaxy was finally starting to appreciate just how dangerous that could be.